Today on Rethink Real Estate, we have Sean Soderstrom. He's the CEO of Courted. Now, Courted is a product that ultimately aggregates all real estate data from MLSs in the country. Now, we've used it as a recruitment tool and as a tool in order to analyze our own businesses in the marketplace. It is an incredible system that is user-friendly, and I'm really excited to have somebody like Sean joining Rethink Real Estate for this episode because he can give us incredible insights. He's probably someone that sees more real estate data across the US than any other person that we would ever have on Rethink Real Estate. And his general outlooks of MLSs and then real estate portals and where the market is going in 2025, and then some of the shocking facts that he can find within brokerages and for agents as well. This is a very detailed episode into the sense of advantages that you can have when you know the data. And it's also something that I'm looking forward to, being a little bit of a data nerd myself. Thanks so much. Welcome to Rethink Real Estate. My name is Ben Brady, and this is a real estate podcast aimed to deliver sales strategies, marketing tips, and business insights from industry experts and myself to build a listing-focused business for the future. Let's get into it. Sean, welcome to Rethink Real Estate.
Thanks so much for having me, Ben.
So I'm pretty excited to jump on with you because most people won't understand this, but I'm a bit of a data nerd. I really love running through certain things, but also I've really loved understanding the practicality of data within North America from the MLS's perspective and how you've sort of pulled it all together. But for those that are just sort of tuning in, why should they hang around and listen to the episode?
I think what we're going to talk about today is really the role that data can play in the experience of running a brokerage, running a team, being an agent. So I think we'll talk about how do we get access to the information, but also just some practical applications of how you can use it and what are some of the ways that you can make data your competitive advantage.
Perfect. Well, again, full disclosure is that we are a customer of Courted. So at the end of the day, we really love it. We use it to run our full recruitment division. Because of the accuracies that we see within that data and the trends that we can pull. But we also use Courted as well. So, for example, we're off the back of 2025 business planning with our agents individually and then also our individual businesses. So what we've used Courted for is to compare the agents and our offices to the very best or the top 10 or top 10% of agents and offices within their marketplace so that we can see what are they missing or what are they doing differently or just measuring them against the absolute best within their market. We're benefited that, a couple of our offices are the very best in their market. So then we use it in order to track how close or others as well. But the thing that I can really appreciate with what you're trying to do is that in Australia and New Zealand, where we're originally from and where I'm originally from, we have, companies like it's called RP Data, which CoreLogic owns it. Okay. And that was sort of the crux of how everybody did real estate in Australia and New Zealand. Data is incredibly available to us in Australia. So I could tell you right now, each individual office's market share of an individual area. I could tell you individual agents' market share of that area if we walked into that. And coming over here to the North America about 10 plus years ago, it was something that we were very blind in because we couldn't get overall data because it was individually owned by the MLSs, or it was just really hard to get overall data to jump into that market. And I believe that you guys are certainly opening that field up. So I'd love to hear a bit of a backstory on how you got into this, why it's, something that you guys have chosen to do and how you've done it, in the sense that I know how difficult it is because we have our own internal systems where we have to feed from the MLSs, and it honestly sometimes is like dealing with Siberia.
Yeah. Okay. Well, sounds great. I will say you mentioned you're a bit of a data nerd. That's very clear from your team as well, working with your team, how into data and analysis and insights your team is. So it clearly flows through to the rest of the organization. In terms of me, I really started my career in management consulting at McKinsey. And so for me, that was a wonderful place to start. It was kind of having exposure, right out of college to some of the most talented executives globally. And there was kind of an apprenticeship model at McKinsey. So you spend very little time in a classroom and much more time basically working with super talented leaders internally, but also even more talented in most cases, folks on the client side. About 11 years ago, I found my way at Compass. It was called Urban Compass at the time. And I was working directly for Robert Refkin, leading national expansion and growth for the company. And there were only about 30 employees at the time, so it was a very small business. And a lot of my day to day was focused on how do we grow this company, thinking about organic growth, like recruitment or M&A. And we were doing much smaller scale M&A than you see in some of the news today from Compass. And then all of the execution work around getting those markets active and recruiting the agents and integrating companies that we might have acquired. And in that context, I ran into some of the issues that you were kind of talking about, Ben, in the sense that, when we think about, just as an example of recruitment, we didn't have a really good view as to what agents had done historically or what they were doing in the future. We were relying on self-reported information in terms of social media posts or things that are, partially reported on platforms like Realtor.com or Zillow. And as you say, right, there's data in different MLSs. So you have the structure of more than 500 MLSs in the country. And so sometimes you'll have part of an agent's production in one MLS and part of an agent's production in another. And of course, the agents themselves need to be part of various MLSs depending on the geography that they live in. And I'm sure we'll talk about some of the ways that we think that structure could evolve in the future. But the point for me was that we weren't really using data to our advantage. And so, and that really cascaded through to, what might they do in the future? What's the right way to communicate with them? We were very impersonal in the way that we were reaching out, or we were spending too long to understand, who's actually a good fit, and then to generate something that really stood out from a recruiting messaging perspective. And then there was no real good system to follow up. So I now run Courted, which is, as you said, right, a platform that works with brokerages, teams, and agents. And we think of it as a kind of an all-in-one solution to accomplish recruitment, retention, and research. And in the way that we kind of formulate the platform, it's very data-driven. So I draw a distinction between what we do and maybe your typical CRM, where you need to load your own sphere of influence or contacts or other things to it. We actually pre-populate the universe of everything that's going on in terms of an agent's market share to market trends to what even might an agent do in the future from the perspective of using some algorithmic approaches to forecast behavior into the future. And there's a whole bunch of different aspects to it. But as you say, it is very, very data driven. So we kind of got a crash course in trying to build something that's kind of at an aggregated level and then trying to kind of disseminate that to brokerages, agents, and teams.
The thing that I'm really fascinated in, Sean, is your outlook for 2025. I know we're diving into this pretty early on in the podcast, but there's very few people that I'd probably speak to outside of, analysts of probably Fortune 500 companies or, investment banks and PE firms and whatever it may be that would probably see the volume of real estate data that you would. I'd love to get an understanding of what you guys believe will happen or that you're seeing from a trend perspective in some of the marketplaces for 2025, because there's so many individual factors. The benefit that we have is that the recording of this episode is very close to its release date, so therefore it's going to stay very relevant. And we've just come off the back of people saying that the 10-year is going up and that interest rates are going to stay higher for longer. From a transaction perspective, is that, we've definitely gone through our drought or our own transaction volume recession, in my own opinion, in real estate for the last 6 to 12 months. Do you see that continuing from what you're seeing at the moment, or any trends that your algorithms, so to speak, are seeing from an agent perspective?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, big caveat that anyone who's prognosticating about the market specifically is generally going to be wrong.
Yeah.
I think first of all, we're not economists in the sense of, it's not our kind of job to predict, for example, market levels. What we do is more at the individual level, which I can talk about. But I think what is really interesting when, as you say, I have access to a lot of information, a lot of different markets, is that we're seeing very individualized trends and themes based on the specific market. So you could look overall and say, okay, right, like obviously the rate of transactions is highly interest rate and negatively correlated with interest rates, and that's kind of the environment that we've been in. Maybe 2 months ago, we were forecasting a decline in rates and maybe an uptick in transaction volume over the next 12 months. All of the big banks are forecasting somewhere between 4.4 and 4.8 million transactions. So that's between 10 to 20% increase nationally around the country. And I think, I think that's probably our confidence interval as well, probably somewhere between 4.4 and 4.8. I think what we are starting to look at, and this is what I would encourage people to do, because each of the folks listening is probably located in a specific market or a series of markets, and how do we create something that's actually useful for me? It's one thing to say, okay, what's going to happen across the country? We tend to look at some of those indicators that are potentially showing signals of the market shifting into more of a balanced market, so like out of a seller's market into a more balanced market, or potentially moving into a more of a buyer's market, right? Sure. And so some of the types of things that I would tend to encourage people to look at are inventory changes. And not just monthly, right? Because we have this seasonality impact in different months, but maybe looking at December 24 versus December 23, right. or Q4 versus 2024 versus 2023. And when we start to do that, in many markets, we've actually seen a dramatic increase between 10 to 25% increase in new inventory levels. That was unlocked, I think, as a result of there being clarity following the election in November. And so we saw actually 6 weeks of really strong data in a lot of markets coming out of the election and into the new year. And some of the other things to look at. So in addition to inventory, when we see trends, so for example, rising inventory with increasing days on market and decreasing close to list price ratio, those are signals that there's, obviously more inventory, so it's taking longer to sell, and then the prices are coming down relative to list. That's a sign that if that continues, it can be a really good thing in terms of unlocking more transactions occurring over Q1, Q2. And so those are the signals that we're really trying to pay attention to. And then the question is, okay, if you see those signals in your market, what do you do with that information, right? Because as you, I'm sure, believe as well, data for data's sake is kind of useless, right? Data for like I want to take an action on this. So maybe I'm going to unlock that budget that I was saving until the market was coming back, and I'm going to start farming more aggressively. Or now's the time to kind of double down on my sphere of influence because I have a whole bunch of folks that were excited to buy a home that just got kind of priced out, or the rates were at an unsustainable level. If we want to get our clients into a position where they are kind of ready to take advantage, if we do see some movement downward in terms of interest rates, paying attention to some of those trends in terms of what's happening in your market is a really good place to start.
Some really solid points. The thing that I take away from the very beginning of what you said as well that I could definitely really agree with is the fact that the individual scale of marketplaces is so different depending on the type of area that you have. So for example, is that you say between I think it was 4.4 and 4.8 million transactions. People think, oh, that's going to be an even split across the board, whatever it is. I really don't see it that way, because if we were to take our own individual business that is predominantly based in Southern California and Oregon, Southern California has been really affected by the lack of transactions, whereas Oregon is still the same pretty much, so because you've got that inbound nature of people moving to those marketplaces, they're going to be less affected than, say, the Southern California market, where you're seeing, a migration out of that to more affordability in different areas and so on and so forth. We also get to see, we have a non-distressed auction business as well, where we do auctions external to our own Harcourts network. We did it in about 30 states last year, and you can see the uplift in trend. So for example, we'll get a whole bunch of inbound inquiry about, can we use your process to sell our listing? And Florida was one of those big places. Texas was as well, in certain markets of Texas, and Tennessee. And if you were to look at the trends within those markets in those times, is that the inventory level was skyrocketing, and that percentage of listed price to sale price was increasing dramatically in those marketplaces at the time. So it's enabled us to sort of discover new marketplaces by looking at that. And if we can look at that on a more individual level, I think that gives us greater depth and insight to our business. And we can, as you said, pick that trend beforehand, use that budget or whatever it looks like. Now, I wanted to sort of move in a direction of getting your general thoughts of the industry as a whole. You know, you and I had the benefit of sort of having a quick chat before we jumped on this episode. And one of the things that you definitely opened my mind up to in that conversation, because nobody had really put it to me that way before, is that there's this thing against the MLSs at the moment. You're seeing industry leaders that are sort of definitely going after the MLSs, and I definitely, being somebody that has operated in 4 or 5 different countries with the auction process, understand that the US is really the only place in the world that has an MLS. Canada has a sort of MLS, but they're not obligated to use it. But the US is predominantly MLS based. Now, there's definite advantages to that, but a lot of people are sort of targeting the MLSs to say that they're out of date at this point. But then you made a really good point to me about what it costs the general consumer in other countries in order to sell their properties, and that price is astronomically high versus what it's like to sell your home in the US. Yes, commission percentages are higher, but in many of the other countries, the seller is paying for their own marketing as well. So I'd love to get your general thoughts of MLSs, their place in the world at the moment over the next 3, 4, 5, 10 years, and that whole side of it, because that's where you're drawing a lot of your data from, correct?
That's right. That's right. And you started at the beginning of the episode with an interesting anecdote in terms of your experience in Australia versus in the US. Outside of that kind of specific example of what you had access to in Australia, I believe that we have a really well-functioning system in the US in a few different respects. So first of all, we have access to consistent, up-to-date, so real-time and historical information that goes back, in most cases, 10 to 15 years in terms of production. I think the fact that the MLSs have made a big push to comply by the REZO standards have meant that the definition of certain things, whether it's count of bedrooms or how you define interior square footage and how do you calculate it, the fact that that's consistent across markets is super helpful for a variety of reasons. One, agents can have confidence in guiding their consumers across whether and post-pandemic, consumers have a broader series of geographies that they may want to consider buying and selling in. There's a lot of second homes being bought all over the place. I think it also inspires, while there is a lot of competition between brokerages, of course, in terms of recruiting and that dynamic, a lot of collaboration when it comes to the transaction, right? So you'll very often see, in most cases, agents working with an agent at another company on another side of the deal because they have access to the listings, right? For example. And so what you have in countries like Australia and, for example, in Sweden, my father's from Sweden and my wife is from this, I'm pretty familiar with that market, is you have the equivalent of a Zillow there, and it's called Hemnet. And Hemnet has effectively become the repository of information. So if you're a seller and you want to sell your home, you have to pay a fee to Hemnet in order to get that property kind of marketed and syndicated around the internet. The fees for Hemnet, so their self-reported average revenue per listing, because they make money per listing, have increased 8-fold over the last 8 years. And so they have near monopolistic pricing power on the one hand. So they are extracting a lot of value because an agent needs to market the home, or the seller needs to market their home. And basically what happens in that context is 2 things. One is there's basically competition for how much can I spend on this portal to make my property stand out.
Yeah, that's a good point.
That is quite challenging. That doesn't serve the consumer in the long run because the consumer is actually paying and kind of a price taker in that situation.
Yeah.
And it certainly doesn't benefit the agent in any way because the consumer is basically forced to market on that side. I think the second thing is the availability of data, if you look in Sweden versus the US, and this is also true in the UK and other places, is not as consistent and not as exhaustive historically.
No.
And I believe in Australia, you have to pay extra and extra to get this historical information. And so just having access to the availability of the data in the first place is challenging from the agent's perspective.
Yep.
Let's take the other side of the coin too, which is if you believe that my view is if you believe that technology is going to support the role of the agent or the process of buying or selling a home in the future, do you want to be dependent on a single company to provide all of the solutions that you would want surrounding that real estate data? So would you want your Zillow or your Hemnet to be the one to provide you every single solution that you would need as an agent? Or would you rather have a system that where the agents input it and then the agents have access to it and technologies can be built on top of it, whether it's my business building tools to help brokerages, agents, and teams grow, whether it's a virtual staging company that's allowing you to do virtual reality tours, or in the future, augmented reality tours with property information that allow you to have 3,000 people view the home versus 30 people coming to the open house and answering some of those questions for you. So there's a whole network of companies. It's often confusing how many companies there are to use, and that's a whole separate, Tech Tony could probably answer that for you in terms of which technologies to look at. But the whole series of innovation that comes from having access to this data is critical. And listen, while I say all of those things, I have plenty of ideas of how we can improve the MLS structure that we have.
Sure.
But in general, I find that it's a very well functioning system relative to what folks have access to, and it's particularly at the price that they have access to it relative to other countries.
Yeah, if you really look into that, and there's just been this general consensus for so long that just based on, I think, the UI or UX sort of feel of the MLSs really allows you to sort of take aim at it in the very beginning, even though you're probably not appreciating what it's doing from the collective data perspective and the accuracy to that. But just to shed some light on the it's not even monopolistic, it's mafia style. In Australia, there's no question about it. REA is the most, realestate.com.au is the most profitable real estate portal in the world. Mm-hmm. Just to give you an understanding of what's happened over the last 10 years since I've moved to the US, is that I remember leaving Australia and to go onto realestate.com.au, it was about $1,000, about $1,200. Now that was to become what they call a premier property, because if you just put your property on realestate.com.au, you can do so for about $250, $300, or you used to be able to. That doesn't exist anymore, but you are on page 15. Now, if you go to be a premier property, you've got to be $1,200, and then everybody was just doing that. I believe now the Australians on this will probably be screaming at me because I'm probably going to get the price wrong, but I believe now it's somewhere in the vicinity of about $5,000 to get yourself at the top of the page for that zip code or that area, so to speak. Now, that's on, even if you're selling a $350,000 property, you still need to pay that amount of money. Yeah. And that is just an increase over that period of time. And there's even more money that you can spend even further to that in order to increase or enhance your listing even deeper and further. And it is a mafia style of real estate because it's only one individual portal and nobody can now catch up to them in any way. There is a sort of function to that in New Zealand that's a little bit better. And I don't know how they got to this, but there is the one main realestate.com.nz, I believe it is, or it might even be TradeLink, I think is the name of it. It's owned by all of the real estate companies and by the governing body. And you see it a little bit more, I don't know, it's a much more price managed thing in that country. Yeah. Same structure as what Australia is, but it being managed by the real estate companies, you haven't seen the uptick of what it costs. Now, again, I'm not speaking relevant to that because I haven't looked at it for years and years and years and years, but it's a very appropriate point to the real estate agents that are very anti-MLS or whatever it looks like, is that it is keeping the cost down in a much larger way and creating an opportunity for the industry to still move forward in the right direction, I think. And again, you've helped me understand that a little bit.
Yeah. And listen, the other thing is, it's my firm belief that an agent representing a $350,000 home should have the same ability to market the property as someone selling a $3.5 million home. And when you get to a place where a portal has pricing power like that, it's the lower value homes that are the ones who are suffering the most.
Yeah, for sure.
Because this pricing is based on a per listing basis, not based on a percentage of your sale price. And so, in some ways, it's really focused on a specific market segment to the detriment of others. Yeah. And I think any agent that's advocating for the breakup of these things and a variety of different individualized silos should pay attention to that fact. Certainly the ones who run the portals might be successful. But in all the research that we did at McKinsey working with some portals, what the consumer wants, and this is the benefit of Australia and quite frankly the benefit of Zillow today, is they want the breadth, the exhaustiveness. They want to be confident that all of the listings I may ever want to see are on this site before I start liking and sharing and commenting on all of the different opportunities there. And so we have this opportunity to actually erode consumer trust if we now have 15 places that you need to go to find a property. And I think the brokerages that are advocating for this, it's very clear in terms of what they're trying to do, and it will benefit certainly some of the largest brokerages in the country from a recruiting perspective. Whether it benefits their own agents in the long run is to be determined. And in my opinion, it's severely going to harm the brokerages that are not the top 10 in the country. And so it's an interesting time. And that's not to say that, the current ways that clear cooperation has been written and codified is perfect. Few people are going to advocate for that, but generally speaking, I think I'm a big proponent of the role of the MLS with some changes.
So that sort of leads to two different questions that I've got for you, just from a trend perspective. Is that first and foremost, is that the clear cooperation and the changes that you've seen, say over the last 6 months, I'll just round it out, and obviously those changes didn't come into effect until later within a 6-month period. But have you seen? And again, this is probably a more general comment that you can lead on. It's probably more individualized in different markets, of course. But have you seen buyer side commissions take a hit in any way, shape, or form in any of the data?
So what's interesting is part of the ruling is that data is now very hard to come by. So but I will say that what we observed in the weeks and month or two following the ruling were, in most cases, listing agents, and I think many of the listeners of this podcast are attempting to be or already are listing focused agents, is that listing agents were continuing to offer the commission rate for both sides, and of course maybe it doesn't flow through the listing agent any longer in terms of how the commission works. But we were seeing a lot of sellers who were encouraged to kind of continue to offer that commission to
be open to it,
the buy side. So we haven't seen a significant drop off. A lot of people were worried about that kind of immediate and significant drop off. I would expect to see some drop off on the rates, the commission rates that buyers agents are commanding over time. The question is, how quickly is it going to happen?
Yeah,
and I think for an individual agent, a team, or a broker just kind of thinking about this, I tend to encourage folks to think about this kind of modern, to be inspired by modern portfolio theory, right? So in modern portfolio theory, which kind of guides how many people think about investing, you don't want to have all of your assets tied up in one thing, right? And in a devastating way, for many people in Southern California today, a lot of assets were tied up in homes that have now been completely destroyed. And that's absolutely devastating. And hearts are with them. And so in that respect, though, from your business, not being overly focused on, for example, overly concentrated on the buy side in a specific segment is a way to kind of insulate yourself from potential things that might occur, right? So we don't know if commission rates are going to go down, but in the situation that they might, focusing now on building up your listing side of your business
Absolutely.
can be a really nice way to kind of insulate you from that. If you're a team focused on that, then maybe you might want to consider recruiting some agents who do more focus on the list side. And the same thing from a brokerage perspective. So we're seeing a lot of people who are a bit more forward thinking, just trying to protect themselves from that potential eventuality. And I think that's smart planning to do right now.
I think that the only thing that I could add to that is that if we're looking at our individual brokerages across, just California and Oregon, is if you've seen the buyer side fee actually stand up really well, and we've just reflected on that recently. However, that being said, is that I can see it from another perspective, being our auction business, where, keep in mind, we do live auctions, and in those moments of negotiation, the first thing that is thrown into those negotiation moments in a competitive situation is the buyer side compensation. Our buyer side compensation that we see our sellers pay out on the auction front of things at a live competitive auction is far less, lower than 70% of what it would be in a traditional sense. So I think that it's one thing from an agent perspective, we've got to be conscious of the fact that yes, we all want the marketplace to return, and we want volume of transactions, and we want multiple offers on our listings and everything. But be conscious of the fact that from a buyer side perspective, if you are that person, I think that's when we will really see some downward pressure on buyer side commissions in those competitive markets, in those competitive multiple offer situations again, where we haven't seen that in most marketplaces over the last, since really the change, if you were to look at it that way.
Yeah.
I wanted to jump into as I want to be conscious of time, of course, but I wanted to jump into just one final question, because you guys get to work with a great deal of brokerages and large companies, and you get to show them the data that you guys collect in their marketplaces and over a wider perspective. Is there any distinct things that you would say that most brokerages or the people that you're dealing with are surprised at when they look at the data that you are offering them? Because I think you give a very clear, it's very user-friendly, it's a great product to jump on there, it's intuitive in a lot of different ways as well. And I think that when you look at it from an MLS data perspective, it's not as clear, it's harder to find. Like I said, that UI UX feel of that MLS is so much more difficult, where you've really taken that and made it really easy to use. What are the things they're most surprised about, do you think?
Yeah, good question. So I'll answer that from the agent's perspective, and then I'll answer that from maybe the brokerage and team perspective. So from the agent perspective, and this connects actually nicely back to what we were just talking about, in a world in which where the commission rate is not expected, but the commission rate needs to be earned and justified, we're seeing a lot of agents who are starting to try to use data to justify their value. So I'll give you a very specific example. And this is, again, where some people are often surprised. An agent might log in, they'll look up themselves on the platform, and they'll realize that their close to list price ratio is significantly higher than the other agents who represent listings in the same price bracket in the same town or same city. And so they're surprised by that. But again, we don't stop there, right? You have to actually take action. So what's the insight? The insight is, the next time you go to a listing presentation, show that you're delivering 5 to 7% of value relative to the list price. And that's the justification of any commission that they may be concerned about, right?
Yeah.
Especially if you have the opportunity to compare that versus the other agents who are also trying to sell that home. If you are able to get that list from the potential seller, right? So I think that's one thing, is to basically compare, where agents are able to now compare themselves relative to a market that's similar or relevant for them. I think for brokerages, there's, I guess, one thing about themselves and then one thing about the market. So I think on the market, brokerages are often surprised as to which is the best or the richest opportunity to recruit from an agent migration perspective. So one of the things that we do is we look at all of the different agents that move, how that trends over time. We look at this at specific regions, and we can identify, for example, how many agents in the $1 to $5 million sales volume band moved between companies last year. And we can compare that versus all of the other ones. And so what we see is actually very different trends in different markets. So in places like Southern California, not that many big top producers moved in the last 12 months, which was interesting. But on the other end, many agents in the $1 to $5 million segment moved. And it was a function, as you say, of a slower market, right?
Yep.
And that's inversely correlated to the underlying real estate market. So more agents tend to move when they're less busy and they're ready to make a change, and they're considering kind of a new option, and maybe they got a call from a brokerage across the street. And then I think the thing that people are often really interested in looking at internally is we're able to, I know this sounds a little crazy, but we're actually able to forecast accurately 4 out of 5 agents before they leave their company. And so teams look at this as well to see like where are the flight risk and who do I need to pay attention to. So what the brokerages will often do is say, okay, who's most likely to leave within the company? And then we have another section on the platform that shows them all of the milestones of all of the agents in real time. So Ben just did his first listing at the brokerage. Jane just did her highest closing of her career, and then an ability to send a personalized message relative to that or relating to that milestone very quickly. So I guess they're surprised by how data can be used to actually facilitate more human connection. It sounds kind of funny, but we're using a lot of data to kind of create these insights, but then you're also using technology to basically start a conversation with somebody that you don't know yet or that you know well, and you're trying to kind of re-engage. And so I think those are places where I think technology can really be kind of a co-pilot or an additional teammate for you where it's kind of hard to otherwise.
Well, I think that where I would just like to commend you on understanding that more than you can see any other product that is out there on the market is the fact that we were doing this for the last 3 years prior to actually using Courted within our own offices. We have our own business planning templates that we had created through Airtable, where it would update the roster of each individual office. And our job with the business owner and broker every month was to go through every single person within their office, and we would manually put in what they did for the month or what they didn't versus what their goal was for the year or what our internal goal was for them. And we would see whether they were on track, off track, or what they were doing. And it's amazing that like when you've got people that are running brokerages with 40, 50, 100 brokers or agents, so to speak, you had to do that with them to go, oh shit, I need to call that person because they did just have a massive closing. And if we didn't do that, there was never any thought to that really outside of it because of just the day-to-day that was happening. And this really does give us an opportunity to automate that, and it actually gives us an opportunity to do it with so many more people because it was such an arduous task to do.
Yeah. I obviously, as I mentioned, we worked at a brokerage, and we would get reports from the wonderful accounting team 6 weeks after the transaction occurred, and it was obviously you're not communicating with someone in an Excel, and obviously that Excel of the transactions in the last month didn't tell you whether it didn't add any context to the transaction, right? So I can definitely sympathize in terms of how manual that can be and challenging. And so I think in general, if technology can take the kind of boring manual tasks off your plate so you can focus on being face-to-face with an agent, that's where kind of magic happens. So how do we get, as a brokerage leader or even as an agent with the customer, more time face-to-face with the customer? If technology in general can help you to do that, then I think that might be a technology worth exploring. We're certainly not the only ones who try to help folks to save time and make better decisions faster, but I'm glad that has been your team's experience.
Yeah. Well, again, we're going to wrap up the episode here, and Sean, we appreciate you jumping on. But, the other thing that I'd love to have you back on in a later date is that, also one of the things that sort of definitely just triggers my own mind, and you're going to be like, oh, don't mention this at the end of the episode. I could give you so much more color. But, the reality is that plugging in AI, that learns the data into what you're providing and just having it do certain things as that whole process develops makes me salivate, so to speak, with ultimately what you could see out of it. But Sean, we appreciate you jumping on to Rethink Real Estate and giving your insights into the industry because you're definitely well versed.
Thanks so much for having me on, Ben. Really nice to talk to you.
So about 75% of our audience hasn't liked, followed, or subscribed to our podcast. It would mean the world to us, and it would help this podcast more than you know to expand our reach if you were to like, follow, or subscribe on any of the platforms that you're watching or listening on. Thanks again.